Chapter 29. Flight of the Dragon. As the sun steadily scaled the horizon eastward over the Fourth Sea, more and more details of the land below became visible. Caleb took in the breathtaking view of the Westerlands from high above its soil. To his right stretched out the wide expanse of the Kingdom of Avondale, and behind him the Kingdom of Manon. Shorewell was located at Manon's far eastern border, but from the new height Caleb could make out the pale outline of Manon's fingers, the appendage-like stretches of land at the kingdom's center that housed the capital. The whole watery country looked like a marsh from above. Below them were the crags of the Titan mountain range that divided the Westerlands in two, right down the center, with Avondale on the east side and Faldesia on the west. They had followed the mountain range northward for all of the first quarter of the morning. He thought they were flying lower than when he had first been taken up in the air so many nights before, as they glided just below the clouds. They sometimes got so close to the mountains below them that they all clung harder to the ropes and held on for their lives. Eventually Caleb at least got used to it, and guessed Leothran was trying to avoid being seen as much as possible. He also was sure that she was aware that the higher she went, the harder it would become for them to breathe comfortably, a fact Caleb well remembered. He was fascinated by the view below him. The Titan Mountains were but a tall wall of rock from the windows of Tritus, but now looking down on top of them they made a flat stone maze of winding cracks and endless labyrinths of paths that were wide enough to be a kingdom in and of itself. He looked for the Jordan Pass, but whether from the haze scattered about the tops of the peaks or from his own error he could not find it. As they had all suspected, a cold wind assaulted them as Leothran pressed forward. Only minutes in the air, they learned that if they leaned forward with their stomachs to the dragon's back as much as possible, that most of the wind would pass over them. Being behind the rest of them, Caleb often looked up with squinting eyes that burned from the chafe of the airstream, to check how his companions were faring. Anselm seemed to be at ease, as always, if not a little nervous of their height, but was countering his fears by checking his rope and knots periodically. Always he kept a wary eye on Leothran, and would occasionally holler something at her, but the words were indiscernible. Leothran would turn her head slightly in acknowledgement, but could not reply. Layla seemed to be managing well also, and could not stop watching the terrain below her in wonder. She clung to the ropes and would throw her belly forward in surprise whenever they tilted too much in one direction, but recovered quickly. Alastra, on the other hand, was not doing as well. From the moment she had left the ground, she had been holding fast to Leothran's back and the ropes, as if the winds were arms trying to tear her away. Caleb saw her dare to look down a few times, quick glances at first, and noticed she was progressively getting braver and watching at longer intervals. Caleb smiled as he watched her check for jewelry that may have blown away in the wind. The tingling in his own feet wore away after half an hour of flying, and after experimenting with the balance he had and the strength of the winds, he actually grew rather comfortable. When the wind was calmer, he almost brought himself to sit up straight. Once he dared to let go of the ropes and tapped on Layla's back. She turned to see him with both arms over his head and a smile on his face, but she was not amused. "Are you mad?" she yelled at him. Some of her tied red hair had come loose and was dancing violently around her face. The sound of the wind blasting around them made her words only audible to him. He knew that Layla would not be able to hear if he shouted back, so he just shrugged, and she turned away, shaking her head with a hint of a smile. The terrain below them slowly changed as they continued northward. He could not see details, but the colors of the ground were changing on the left side of the Titans. He knew that the elevation progressively dropped as Manon melted into Faldesia, which resulted in a much warmer climate than Avondale or Manon, with sparse grass that was more gray than green. Halfway through the day, the riders all remembered that they had to eat, and over the space of an hour, cautiously reached into their bags and passed bread and fruit around, all the while holding the ropes with at least one hand, with the exception of Alastra, who attempted in vain to eat with no hands so as to keep a firm grip on the knots. Hours passed. For a long while, Caleb had kept track of their progress based on landmarks like lakes and cities, but after eating and dozing off a few times he lost track. Every now and then, he caught glimpses of small dots of a city or towns far below them at the foot of the mountains, and he wondered if there were any people who noticed them flying silently through the sky. He thought of the invaders, and of General Palson he had seen in Shorewell marching out from the city, bent on burning Paladar to the ground, and hoped that they would be able to make use of the time they were gaining to form a counter-plan. How do they intend to march on Paladar after losing so many men in Avondale, and the men they will surely lose through Faldecia? What is the gift the Queen spoke of that will give them advantage enough to have a chance of victory? She cannot be so foolish as to think Faldecia will fall so easily. And what of these spirits she speaks with? The voice from beyond, what in fate's name were they talking about? How could she possibly be speaking with the dead? And why? With the exception of all of them getting more and more physically irritated from sitting on Leothran's hard, red scales, the day passed them by uneventfully. By the time the sun was starting to fall in the last quarter of the day, the air had grown icy cold, and they all bundled up as much as they could inside their cloaks. They all put on gloves, and Caleb even managed to reach into the bags and give Layla and Elastra the red Talgathian cloaks they still carried with them. They all laid low to the dragon's back and hid from the cold wind, remaining that way until Anselm turned back to them a while later and shouted, "We are making incredible time. We could be close by nightfall at this rate, but I'm not sure if Leo is up for it. She seems to be slowing down." It was then that Caleb noticed they had indeed changed directions and were now flying nearly northwest. He could see nothing but mountains below and behind him, but up ahead there was solid ground again, stretching out as far as the eye could see, woven with streams and rivers and dotted with forests. "Technically, I think we are in Faldecia now." Anselm continued to holler back at them all. "Although I can't be sure how far south we are of Paladar until we can get closer." He turned to Leothran and placed a hand on her scaly neck and said something. Caleb could not hear the exact words, but soon after a loud ringing cry erupted from the dragon's throat. After a whole day of the monotonous rush of the wind in their ears, it split the air like the loudest noise to ever sound. Anselm turned back to them again. "She needs to land as soon as possible. We have already gained a week on the invaders, and there is no need to push her further." His face was riddled with concern, a face Caleb rarely saw on him. They all nodded in agreement, and Anselm yelled something out to Leothran. This time Caleb caught the words "land" and "risk." They continued to fly on, however. Eventually they came to the end of the Titan Mountains, and Leothran beat her wings and dropped lower to hover only 100 spans from the ground. Below them was bleak-looking land made up of patches of faded grass and what looked like dirt, with sharp rocks jutting up out of the earth here and there. A light mist rolled below them, and Caleb could not see any town or villages anywhere, as would be expected this close to the mountains. He thought they would stop soon, but on they went, and he could see Anselm nearly standing on his knees and shouting to Leothran. She replied with another loud cry. "I don't think she wants to stop yet," Anselm yelled back at them all. "But I think she is getting weaker. I keep telling her to land." As helpless riders they were forced to wait until she stopped. She continued on for another hour, and then at last the winds that had been blasting their ears began to settle, as Leothran beat her wings against the air to slow herself down. She descended slowly and smoothly, and she let her mass down with ease until the last 10 paces when her wings seemed to give up. She dropped and hit the ground hard, her back legs supporting her but her front legs limp. They all held to the ropes to stay on her back, and Caleb grunted when they hit. Scales were not the most effective padding. Anselm jumped from her back when they landed without a moment's hesitation, and not realizing how tired he was, fell flat on his face. He stumbled up and ran to Leothran's head and placed his hands on her beak snout. "Leothran, are you all right?" Leothran was taking in long deep breaths through her giant nostrils, making her back rise and fall with them atop it. Her wings were draped out to her sides as if they had no life in them. Caleb jumped off next, taking a little more care than Anselm did by throwing his weapons down first and rolling when he hit the ground to ease the 20-pace fall. He stood next to the dragon's side, while Layla and Elastra slowly slid down onto his shoulders where he could help them down. One by one they stumbled tiredly away from Leothran with wobbling strides on cramped knees. Caleb's legs felt like planks and his ears were ringing loudly. He could still feel the strong wind against his chaffed face, and it looked odd to see the ground so close to him. He stretched and tried to shake off the feeling as much as possible. Elastra was lying flat on the rough ground and holding her head, her messy blonde hair strewn about her face. She looked pale in the failing light. Layla looked just as worn, crouched nearby with her eyes closed and teetering as she tried to reorient her balance. "I think she pushed herself too hard," came Anselm's worried voice from near Leothran. His fingers made the formation of a second degree. "I'm going to try a healing hex." "Not yet, fool," Elastra chastised through exasperated pants. "She needs to change back first. Her body is too big like that for only one person to heal." "Caleb, could you get my bags?" Layla asked. He drew his dueling sword and cut the rope around Leothran, and pulled at it until their gear fell to the ground piece by piece. Layla's saddlebag was the last to drop, and he delivered it to her. She opened it and removed Leothran's clothing. "You and Ansel wait over there," she said, pointing to a nearby rock that protruded at an angle a distance away. From behind the rock they heard only a faint rumbling sound, and waited until they heard Layla call them back. Leothran was sitting on the ground, leaning against Layla. She was clothed but trembling terribly, and Elastra was wrapping a cloak and one of the sleeping blankets over the top of her. Anselm ran and dropped to one knee by her side. "Leothran." Her eye still gleamed with the bright yellow light. She nodded slowly. "I will be all right. I just have to rest." Of course. Anselm bumbled, frantically searching for something he could do to help. "Why didn't you stop when we cleared the mountains?" Leothran attempted a smile. "Even a one-eyed serpent can see further than humans." "It was only a little distance further," she said. Her weariness made her accent thicker and more difficult to understand. "But we have reached our goal." Even as she said the words, the sun sinking in the west emerged from behind a cloud, and its rays kindled a spark in the corner of their eyes. They all looked to see a massive city, comparable to the size of Tritus far off in the distance, with only the higher pinnacles of the towers clearly discernible. Just as Elastra and Anselm had explained before, the city reflected the sun's beams beautifully, making it appear as though it were a strand of lightning sitting still on the horizon. The City of Fire. Somehow none of them had noticed it even from above. "We are here," Layla said as she stood to get a better look. "That is incredible. We crossed the distance of an entire kingdom in one day." "Thank you, Leo," Anselm said. "You may have just saved the Westerlands." "Not until we can get there and warn the king, that is," Elastra said. She managed to sit up. "Not another step until she has rested," Anselm said. It seemed Leothran normally would have refused rest, but this time even she nodded and accepted. "Are you hurt?" Caleb asked. "Do you feel anything that may be tied to the curse of the Seer Tarn?" "I felt it," Leothran said. A single tear fell from her eye as she continued to tremble. "The shape of a serpent remains my only tie to my Satyr gifts, and yet I can no longer manage even that. I could feel the darkness. A darkness stealing upon me as I went. Trying to stop me. Trying to make me give up. We had to clear the mountains." She paused to regain her breathing and muttered something in her own speech. "I never knew the great strength it would require to go that far. I fear doing something like that again." "You will not have to," Caleb said, kneeling beside her also. "Rest as much as you need, Leothran. You have more than earned it. We could all use some rest. Tonight we will stay here." Elastra nodded, rubbing the inside of her thighs. "I would have stayed either way," she groaned. Caleb and Layla cut the rest of their bags from the ropes and built a fire, while Anselm and Elastra performed a strong healing hex on Leothran together, furthering their own exhaustion. When the sun was finally disappearing behind the horizon, they had all gathered around the blazing fire, taking the dried meat they had brought from its flames. They had pulled over some nearby stones to sit on, and Leothran was lying on her back close to the fire atop a makeshift bed of cloaks and extra blankets. Her shaking had ceased, and her breathing had deepened since the healing. "The city is still half a day's journey off," Caleb said. "By this time tomorrow, we should be speaking with King Brackmore." "Anselm and Elastra, you said this Paladar is where you were raised as children?" Leothran asked, sitting up on one arm to take a bite of her food. "Will you visit your family?" They looked at each other with doubtful expressions, but neither of them responded. "Are they no longer living?" she guessed. Oh, they're alive and well, all right, Elastra said as she threw the end of a carrot into the fire. They'll be right where we left them 11 years ago in the shop, trying to keep production up and their reputations high. So your parents are artisans? Leothran concluded. What is their craft? Shoes, Anselm cut in. And it was 13 years ago, he corrected his sister's shaky memory. The Flitchits make some of the finest soles in all of Paladar, to be sure. And I have stitched many and know all too well. A worthy trade, Leothran said. Worthy enough to eclipse their own family, Elastra remarked with a cynical laugh. All they ever cared about was their foolish business, so Ansel and I had to always fend for ourselves. We got along fine without them, but got so tired of it all that we left for Tritus to take the pact and learn the ways of the Warden. Anselm nodded. I don't know what they would do if we went back there. But who knows, it has been 13 years. Maybe they've changed. If they have, then fate strike me down, Elastra laughed. Anyway, who cares? We have more important things to worry about. We're here to build defenses against the invaders, not idle our time with a fool's errand. After their meal, Anselm brought out his long pipe again and began to play a soft tune as they each got situated for the night, but after a while the sound faltered, and he found his reed to have cracked from damage sustained during the flight. All of them were exhausted and worn from the blasting winds of the sky, and the hard scales they had to sit on throughout the day. One by one they fell asleep, and Caleb moved 20 paces out from the fire to keep watch. They had only been asleep for a few hours when he heard the sound of horse hooves trotting somewhere nearby. After a moment of squinting in the dark, he could make out the vague shapes of riders, at least 5, cautiously moving toward them and spreading out to encircle their encampment. Caleb walked back to the fire and roused everyone. Wake up. Riders approach. Layla sat up quickly and reached for her bow. The fire. It drew their attention, she said as she threw her blanket off. No weapons are needed, Caleb responded. I guessed our fire would do so. All the better for us to reach the king more quickly. If we can get to him with our heads still on our shoulders, Elastra mumbled as she pulled herself to her feet. Anselm readied himself as well, but all Leothran could manage was to sit up where she was. Anselm stood in front of her protectively. Caleb walked to the edge of their firelight and shouted. Hello. If you ride from Paladar, we ask you show yourselves and speak with us. We bring urgent news from Manon. At once the horsemen emerged from their hiding places surprisingly close behind the rocks and approached them. They came from every angle, surrounding their camp tightly. There were 6 in all, 3 with their swords bared and the others with arrows drawn back in their bows. Caleb put his hands out in a peaceful gesture. Their fire didn't provide enough light to get a good look at them, but they were all wearing heavy armor and carried shields on their backs. Their breastplates bore the emblem of a star bursting with light. Chaldician patrols. Once the soldiers had closed Caleb and his companions in sufficiently, a 7th man rode up between them and stopped just in front of Caleb. You bring news from Manon, do you? He asked. Caleb could not tell if his inquiry was sincere or not. The man was perhaps in his early 40s with a large sturdy build and a square chin with long hair that hung to his shoulders. Who are you then and where are you from? He asked, glaring at each one of them in turn. My name is Caleb Rembrandt. I come from Tritus in the kingdom of Avondale and have traveled long to get here. Invaders from Talgarth of the Estelans have crossed the 4th Sea and have launched an attack on our lands starting at our home and have continued their sweep westward. They come for Paladar next and march even as we speak. We must speak with King Brackmore immediately. All of the men on the horses looked at each other and began whispering amongst themselves, but their leader silenced them by raising his fist. This is quite a surprise, he said. We watch our borders closely, and I have not had word of anyone entering our lands from the south. Now 5 strangers appear out of the sand and claim our kingdom is under attack. Who is to say that you are not all assassins? Shall I escort you to the throne only to let you put a dagger in the king's heart? I think not. We are not fools. The strings on the men's bows pulled back tighter. I am from Paladar, Anselm said. And my sister too. Our parents are well-known cobblers in the city. The Flitchits. The name does not sound familiar, the man said. Elastra stepped in front of her brother. Caleb could tell she was at her wit's end after the flight and interrupted sleep. I don't care what you think. Tritus nearly fell, and the invaders are marching north as we speak, and that is the truth. We have traveled all this way to warn you so you can be more prepared than we were when Talgarth comes pounding on your doors. I am Elastra Flitchett, sage of Tritus, and if this is how we are to be treated, then let us be, and we will watch from here while the city of fire burns. I demand to see the king. The man was rubbing his chin and eyeing them more closely. Anyone could claim to be Sage Flitchett of Tritus. Though you speak with the strength of the part and have nearly convinced me. But it is your name that intrigues me most, the man said, looking at Caleb. Rembrandt. I know this name. Caleb nodded, more than willing to capitalize on his father's fame if it meant saving them from trouble. My father, Damon Rembrandt, is a friend of the king. He is the hero of the West who slew the Dark Sage many years ago. The other guards looked at one another in surprise, and their bows lowered slightly without prompting. Suddenly a smile crept onto the man's face and he laughed aloud. Sage Elastra of Tritus, and her brother along with the son of the hero of the West. He looked at Layla and Leothran. And you ladies must be queens, hailing from across the far reaches and the heartland itself. We speak the truth, sir. Layla started, but the man stopped her. I believe you, my lady. The tale is far too bold, too absurd for an assassin to concoct. He signaled to his men and they lowered their weapons. If what you say about Talgarth is true, then we must go with all haste. But if you truly are enemies of Faldesia, and this is all part of some scheming plot, then I promise you will not leave my sight alive. Deliver up your weapons, and we shall escort you to the city. You shall be watched every moment from now until you leave the gates. As for a meeting with King Brackmore, well, we shall see what can be done. We are grateful, Caleb said, and unfastened his dueling sword from his belt. The riders dismounted and cautiously collected all of their weapons, including Elastra and Anselm's boot knives. They searched through their gear and inside Anselm's satchel, before returning to their mounts satisfied any threat had been confiscated. Luckily, they had not noticed the Talgarth cloaks in the dark. Layla and Anselm helped Leothran to her feet, and all of the horsemen looked at her curiously. Her eye glowed with a faint yellow, though she gazed at the ground trying to hide it. The man watched her struggle curiously. Caleb knew that any more questions regarding her could lead to unwanted trouble. If they were to find out a Sartir traveled with them, their weary company would likely have to fight for their lives here and now. He spoke up before the man could. She is injured, he said. Would any of you be willing to let her ride with you? He hoped that their sense of chivalry would override their sense of curiosity. The men looked at each other again, and the leading man dismounted. I will walk with the rest of you, he said. To keep a closer eye on you all. The lady can ride my horse. He signaled for another one of his men to dismount. And you too, he said, pointing to Layla and Elastra. You may share his horse. They thanked him together, and Elastra, who still looked completely miserable, breathed a sigh of relief at the prospect of having a ride, even if it meant riding with Layla. The 7 soldiers watched them closely as they packed up camp, and afterward their bags were strapped to some of the other men's horses, and they set off toward Paladar in the deepening night.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Episodes go live every Monday and Friday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The audiobook can be purchased in its entirety on Google Play Books. Get the whole trilogy now in both paperback and ebook formats. All links are in the description.